Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who has just lost an hour of his life, and if it's not put back in the next 8 months, there's gonna be hell to pay.
Tim Longo. What the heck? What are you talking about?
Well,
I didn't get it.
Time just sprung ahead.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
So
yeah, it's also automatic these days. You know, you just,
it is. I know.
It happens, and you know, only your stove clock is wrong, and
yes.
everything else is right.
I was going to say, except I had to set my stove and my thermostat and my car. So there are a few things I had to deal with today. Yeah. Anyway, let's not spend too much time, as it were, on that. Can you introduce our guest this week?
Yes, we do have a guest, our second guest for our Civ III series. Very excited to introduce Jeffrey Morris. He goes by Jeffrey, really. He loves it. Jeff Morris is a producer extraordinaire who started in QA in 1995 at Origin Systems, working on the Jane's Military Sim series, where he also was responsible for taking on the Ultima Collection, directing that project to its launch. He then went on to Firaxis in 1998, where he was QA manager on various games, including Alpha Centauri, and then also went on to get his first producer role on Civ III and various expansions beyond that, which we will talk about today, of course. He left Firaxis and to join Epic in 2003, it looked like, and to become a producer on Unreal Tournament 2004, and some production work. He did some production work on Gears of War and pre-production, and eventually finished there with Unreal Tournament 3. He worked at various studios like Red 5, Planet Moon, Crystal Dynamics, and eventually ended up at LucasArts in 2011 to work on an unannounced shooter with me, where I met Jeff and loved working with him, and we've been friends ever since. Once LucasArts shut down, he left to work at companies like Kabam, where he had the role of Senior Director of Project Management, which we will ask about later, and then at NCSoft as Senior Project Manager, and is now an executive producer at Free Range Games, working on some cool stuff that is unannounced. He is one of the best and craziest producers I've ever had the pleasure of working with, and so let's welcome him to the podcast. Hello, Jeff.
Hello, Tim. Jeffrey. Hello, Brett. Thank you so much for that intro. It's as a big fan of the podcast, it's great to have an opportunity to join you guys and talk about something I love a lot.
Awesome. Yes,
awesome.
you you always spoke kindly about your Firaxis days, I remember, and it's very cool that you happen to work on Civ 3, and as you mentioned, was one of your first, if not your first, producer role, right, in the industry?
Yeah, I basically was a programmer, junior programmer on Alpha Centauri, and while at the time I certainly was learning a lot, it became quickly clear that that was not the role for me. I think porting old 80s board games to computers, that's a good use of my programming acumen, but drawing, fat rendering lines and all that kind of stuff was just a carriage return too far for me. So when we were trying to find something that would be better suited, production sort of was a gravitational tug on me and pulled me in, and that was the beginning of what has been my career ever since, which is project management production. Part of the problem, I like to jokingly say.
So taking a step back though, how did you start at Origin specifically, which is, a legendary company? We played Ultima Underworld. I think it's the only Origin game we've played. And so what was, just, we don't have to spend too much time on it because we want to focus on Civ 3 and stuff, but what was it like, starting in the industry at Origin?
Sure. I mean, Origin for me was definitely one of those keystone companies growing up. I was a big Apple II gamer, and most of my early gaming experience that was involving computers, compared to board games, were Apple games, and Origin cast a really huge shadow there. at the time, I had an opportunity to sort of sweet talk my way into a early game developers conference. And back then at GDCs, or it was computer game developers conference back then, they'd have hospitality suites, and they would be basically these recruiting mechanisms. But your company would come down, pound its chest, give free beer out, and try and fill some open roles. And so I was fortunate enough to get into the Origin hospitality suite and meet people like Warren Spector and Star Long and Richard Garriott, and made enough of an impression there that I was able to get a QA interview in Austin, and flew out to Austin and got the job. And that was sort of the beginning of my, professional game development career. Austin, like Baltimore, and I want to talk a little bit about Baltimore, when we get to Civ III and Firaxis, Austin just had a really wonderful game culture, in a large part because of Steve Jackson games and also Origin. And when you have two big heavy hitters like that in the same town, all the sort of startups and spin-offs that come from just the natural ebb and flow of corporate game development, the culture there was just really, really rich. And so for someone who was very much an enthusiast trying to transition into making it a career, it was a very natural sort of transition atmosphere. Like I pretty much shared enough of the common gaming background with everybody that lived in Austin, and was able to succeed well enough there that I've been doing this for over 25 years now.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think people necessarily think, when they see where games come from, they don't necessarily always know that that's because it's been the place for so long. Like, it starts with, say, Garriott, right? And then it just grows there forever. It's a place, where games are made. Dallas is sort of that way because of id, and all the things that happen there, and different hubs are that way. It'd be interesting because I came to Maryland late. I'm kind of curious when we get to that, what your experience in Baltimore would have been 20 years ago.
Yeah, you got it.
When I had moved to a different hub in the San Francisco area.
Well, there's a lot of interesting rivalry between MicroProse and Origin back in the day. Mm-hmm. And even though they made fairly different types of games, they were, two big fish in a relatively small pond. And so one of my favorite Origin memories, and I've got, a million of them, is there was some offsite event they did where they basically were doing, I think it was sort of like a MVP awards of the year kind of thing. And it was at a stand-up club on 6th Street in Austin. And at the end of it, when they were handing out the final award, outside the window of the club on the sidewalk out front, a little MicroProse ship came floating by, and it was a stick puppet that someone out there was putting up. And then Origin came over and blew up the MicroProse ship out of the window, and everybody applauded. And it was this great, realization of that sort of rivalry. And so it's always struck me as, there was a lot of cross-pollination between MicroProse and Firaxis and Avalon Hill and a lot of the Baltimore gaming culture. You didn't see a lot of cross-pollination between the Austin dev culture and Baltimore. There was some significant ones, but it was there was a sort of a bit of a bad blood element there that I think people sort of did tongue in cheek, but also sort of didn't do tongue in cheek.
So Tim mentioned, so the other thing too is, like, Tim mentioned you QA'd on Jane's, and I just want to touch on that just for a second because those are simulation games, and it's military simulation games. And I wonder, like, what was it like to QA a thing where it's a real thing in some sense that you're trying to simulate, but you almost certainly have no experience with that real thing? You know what I mean?
I do.
Like a flight sim or whatever. I don't know what specific games you might have worked on, but what's that like? Like, how do you QA this doesn't fly like a Falcon, right? Obviously it wouldn't have been Falcon for you.
Yeah, there were definitely two camps of flight sims in that era, at least from my perspective. There were the sort of survey sims where you're doing a whole range of different types of aircraft with different cockpits and different electronics and mechanics. And then there were the really deep focused single vehicle sims. I definitely spent a lot of times, and Jane's covered both of those. You had the the longbows of the world, but then you also had the United States Navy fighters of the worlds and advanced tactical fighters of the worlds, which were mine. Those games were very much more about the sort of magical movie-like experience of being in that. And
Top Gun more than...
and balance was, primarily more important than... perfect accuracy. And so for me, I had played a lot of flight sims just because that was such a prototype or a primeval genre on computer games at the time. So I knew a lot about the mechanics of them, but I'd never done a lot of modern air combat. And I got to say, ever since the Janes, I started on Marine Fighters, which was the expansion pack for United States Navy fighters, and then on to ATF and NATO fighters after that, which was its expansion pack. I just fell in love with modern air combat. Like, basically, modern air combat is science fiction. And this is modern air combat 20 years ago. You can only imagine where it's gone since then. But beyond visual range, missile combat, ECM, all those different roles.
Yeah, I played Harrier like FA-22 or whatever. And,
I mean,
like that at that age. Yeah, for sure.
It filled my mind with possibilities. And so there was a lot of good primer there because Baltimore was very much a big military flight sim for, actual flight sim training town. And that was part of the cross-pollination between those two. But yeah, I would say testing it was mainly based on fun factor, balance, and trying to be as defect free as possible. My colleagues working on Longbow 2, the ill-fated A-10 they were working on, and then F-15, which was done in Baltimore, but was part of Jane's and went through Origin QA. Those guys had a very different challenge than I did.
All right, cool. All right, go ahead, Tim. I was jumping in there because I picked up on that and was like, "Ooh, that's an interesting." We haven't had somebody who's worked on a sim, really, a real flight sim, other than Larry Holland, but that was more on the fantasy side as well.
I would say Battlehawks 1942 and Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, those were closer to the ATFs and U.S. Navy fighters than the hardcore ones.
Yeah. Right. No, I was just gonna wax, just on that story from the bar with the boat. I could not. That's the kind of cool sort of almost like indie culture, but back in the day, you know what I mean? Like indie culture now, where there's sorts of fun stories, and we're in such a corporate life now with big video games that that kind of fun just doesn't seem to. Even though it was a rivalry, and like you said, there's some bad blood there or something, but we just don't loosen up as much as we should.
Yeah, I mean, Origin was especially fun in that, from that lens, that they were very much that sort of old school game development, whether it was the Halloweens that Richard Garriott would famously put on at his house, and, the hallway leading to the conference room on the building where I spent most of my time, had all these gold-plated 5 1/4-inch discs for all the games that they had shipped. I think it was 100,000 units back then, but seeing a gold-plated Auto Duel or Mobius or these really vintage Origin games on your way to the conference room, it reminded you of the nerdy but nonetheless significant heritage of what working at Origin meant.
Right. Yeah. So that brings us to Firaxis. Then maybe so what was that? How did that go for you? Was what the kinds of games that MicroProse and Firaxis worked on? Was that what drew you there, or how was that transition?
Yeah, basically, there's a guy named Andy Hollis who did a lot of flight sims at MicroProse, and he was one of the people who talked EA into starting the Janes series. And so he relocated to Austin as part of that to be sort of established at Origin, but really represent the entire Janes brand. By him being in the building, though, we had opportunities to interact. And when Firaxis started to occur when they broke off from MicroProse, Andy Hollis, an ex-MicroProse guy, facilitated a lot of the conversations with Electronic Arts and Firaxis. And Firaxis's first 2 games, Gettysburg and Alpha Centauri, were both published by EA. That was in large part because of the deal that Andy helped broker. And I had no insight into that deal. This could all be legend, but that that was the story going around the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
And so as soon as Gettysburg was announced, which was the first Firaxis game announced, and it became clear that that was going to go through Origin QA because of that Andy Hollis relationship, I started educating myself on the American Civil War, something I had never really thought much about. But I was like, this seems like an opportunity, because I was a project leader in the QA department at Origin, to run a Sid Meier's QA effort. And so I learned about limbered and unlimbered artillery and all the nuances of the American Civil War. And like modern air combat, something I never had a lot of interest in, became, bottomlessly fascinating to me. And the American Civil War to this day is still a hard to believe it occurred kind of tragedy / epic. And sure enough, when Gettysburg came into Origin QA and they were looking for someone to run that project, I was able to secure it. And like is so often the case, the last 6 months of that QA effort involved me being out in Baltimore at Firaxis, working closely with the devs just to expedite turnaround. And I think you guys had mentioned this earlier in the podcast about using gold discs to send around for betas, and that pre-internet day build distribution between two studios was very expensive and fraught and easy to screw up. So getting me out on site just made a lot of sense. Shipping Gettysburg, I did a good enough job that they said, well, I think it makes sense to have a QA guy on site. And Jeff Briggs, who Soren talked at length about, made me a job offer. And I got to say, I know Tim has been in QA, Brett. I don't know what your history is, but if you're in QA, your number one job in QA is to get out of QA. And back then that was the foremost of my mind. I've never worked in a more political environment than the QA department at Origin, just because it was just, I got to get out of here. I'm so close to making it. And so I relocated to Baltimore, became their full-time QA and IT manager, because back then it was very much a, fit in where you can and help out where you can. And was there for shipping Gettysburg. And then I started as a full-time employee for Alpha Centauri, which is another game that, and part of me, I had the same reaction Soren did, which is I was a little confused why you picked Civ 3, and I understand now, but I would have really loved to hear your guys' take on Alpha Centauri, which has, a lot of the mechanics of Civ, but also has this sort of, Dune caliber story laid over the top of it that I would have been fascinated to hear you guys' take on.
Yeah.
Well, I can say briefly, because it's not a podcast about it, that I did love that game and played a fair amount of Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri.
Yeah.
That's one I still have the box around here somewhere. So still have it. It's still here in the building, as it were. So.
Yes,
but yeah, Civ was the series that were like, but we got to talk about Civ.
I agree, and that's the thing I enjoyed the most about listening to you guys play it, is a lot of the little quirks and problems with Civ 3 just really weren't on your radar, because you were sort of enjoying and experiencing what the franchise of Civ brought, and that stuff is still magical and absolutely worth talking about.
So how do we? What is the transition like, if you specifically talk about the roles from QA to production? So we're up to the timeline wise, we're up to Civ 3. You've moved into the production role. And what mentally did you shift? How did the mental shift work for you, if you recall? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to have too many comprehensive recollections about that time, because it has been so long. But I will say that I was never a worse producer than I was on that project, and that's inevitably the starting point of anybody in a career. I had so many mistakes to make, and I was fortunate enough to be able to make those on Civ and other projects. It is one of those things where, like, I can get better as a programmer by being alone in programming. I can get better by an artist by just, doing it again and again and again. Production, you really can't get better at unless someone entrusts you with a team. You can go and read as many books as you want, but it's not really going to give you the sort of takeaways that other disciplines get from that kind of study. You really need to do it and be in the trenches and learn fire hot by sticking your hand in the fire. And so I'd say the initial, it's hard for me not to think of anything but the mistakes, but, one of the initial things that I had to contend with was thinking that I had some responsibility and role within the design of the game. And that's something that, there's probably a book in there somewhere about the transition of producers who have design ownership in the game industry. But back then, as well as at Firaxis, which had very strong design leadership, that all the seats at that table were filled. They didn't necessarily need someone to talk about features before those features existed. Once the feature did exist, and I did a lot of the QA management on that project, they were very interested in hearing what worked and what didn't and what was balanced and that kind of feedback. But a cornerstone of my process as a producer ever since has been a very strict sort of firewall between the creative and the project management worlds, because so frequently the way producers get bad reputations in this industry is by being sort of stealth, manipulative designers trying to get their personal pet ideas across, when really all you're doing is diminishing the ownership over the creative design by the people who have that much more difficult job. So I'd say probably that was very much the beginning of, I don't need to take on coming up with the next new civilization strength or tech tree abstraction. That is all covered. And there's more than enough work outside of that realm for a producer to make significant contributions to, the polish of the game, the quality of the game. And those are areas that I've specialized in ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. So
yeah, that's very well said, because I do think that, you say the QA's job is to get out of QA. Tim is a QA turned designer, and that's actually a common paradigm I've seen. And of course, in that case, it's like, well, I already love games and I know what I like in games, and I'm trying to make that happen, by becoming a designer, make my contribution to games that way. There's almost a QA like focus, the way you're describing production, in the sense of, no, design's going to come up with that, and I'm going to help, see that thing flourish. You know what I mean? It's sort of a different, like, after the, it's the cart after the horse, I guess.
I would say another key takeaway of that time directly to that point was I started to learn the difference between being done and being good. And it was very easy for a producer to say, oh, the asset is in and the code is hooked up and the sound effect is added, and think the job was done. And it was just one of the many ways that I was not a good designer really in any way, shape, or form. The designers then had to take it across the finish line, and Jason Coleman, who Soren mentioned last time, was the lead programmer. The engine for Civ III was called Jackal, which was Jason Coleman's kick-ass libraries. And so he was the author of the engine that we were using. And he sat me down and he had this very earnest conversation with me where he said, I just want you to be clear that there are two different things here, and done is not the same as good, and what we're doing at Firaxis is good. And that was something where everything after done, as a producer, I felt very empowered to improve and make better and make faster and crash less and look better. Just that there was a bottomless amount of areas where a producer could make a big difference. And that's the sort of buzz, the addiction that I eventually discovered that kept me engaged with the discipline. But yeah, that I would say absolutely the role of a producer should often be, I guess back then it's hard for me to distinguish between the QA role and the production role. I would say I probably hid in the QA manager role a little bit because that was an area I had more comfort in. But it still was just a great opportunity to learn the tools of what a producer did and where their input was helpful and where it wasn't so much.
So you, in pre-show, you also mentioned, and I think related to sort of that transition into Civ, you have some history with board gaming potentially, and Civ, and maybe sort of the franchise. I'd love to hear what your history with Civ was coming into Civ 3, because as Soren talked about, and I think it's interesting, totally unanticipated sort of connection between the two of you. I know you know each other. but it hadn't occurred to me sort of his history with the franchise and getting into the industry. And then sort of similar to you, Civ 3 was a big first game for both of you for many reasons. Just by chance, we're having both of you on. But what, and you mentioned also that sort of like the Baltimore scene and sort of like the culture around, that area, and Avalon Hill you even mentioned too. So what was that topic you wanted to kind of elaborate on?
Yeah, I always looked at Civilization as a war game, and I knew there was a lot of paths to victory that didn't involve the eradication of all your rivals. But for me, it was a natural progression of a type of game that I had been playing for years and years and years. And so just like when I looked on the back of a Dungeons and Dragons manual and said, where's Lake Geneva? And looked on the back of Car Wars and said, where's Austin, Texas? I would often look on the back of, Darklands or Covert Action and say, where is Hunt Valley? And the more you sort of learn about that area from the history of Avalon Hill, which was a signature wargaming company back in the day in Baltimore, to the military flight sim industry that was there serving the actual U.S. military. There were certain types of games that all were gravitationally orbiting the Baltimore area. And I had played an old Atari or Apple II game called Empire, which was pretty much Civ without anything not related to combat. So it was just producing units, moving units. It had all the pains of a naval invasion that Soren talked about. It had all those things, but it was this sort of Apple II version of a very clear board game idea. And so for me, that was the sort of natural progression of adding non-conquest mechanisms to win the game that made Civ really stand out. Civ 1 on MS-DOS I played in college, and I had played every Civ game up until that point. But for Civ, that was the one that, like, I was the walking cliche that I had just one more turn-itis to the point where I was missing classes. I'd have my roommate in the dorm sick at 2 a.m, but I would still be playing. It's like, what are you doing? I was just totally lost in that. And like Soren, I missed Civ 2 for reasons I'm not sure I really recall. But Civ had always been a really signature game in my sort of gaming history. And so the idea of it being anything other than a board game that was sort of digitized, it never, I always thought of it that way. And so hearing the way you guys describe it, it was interesting. Like for me, the manual was a huge part of every computer game that I had played up to that point. And I had a personal rule where I would never play a game without reading the manual cover to cover, whether that was, Pool of Radiance in the SSI games or, the Codex of Ultimate Wisdom in Ultima. Like I would read the manual cover to cover. And it was something that was a huge obstacle. Like you're just back from the store, you want to, start playing the game, but it was assumed that you would do that. And I would say that a lot of that is the legacy of the sort of board gaming culture that led into these games, which is, Soren has a great talk on the topic, but you in a board game are the one enforcing the rules. It's incumbent upon you to understand all the rules to the degree that you'd be actually able to run the simulation that they very analogly put together for you. I always looked at it the same way with Civ, that it was up to me to understand what led to corruption and what the costs of, certain decisions were, because I had done my homework and read the manual. I'd even go to say the manual on Civ 3, to bring it to that game, was an experience in and of itself, just because of the amount of text in it. And that's not only in the manual, but the game itself and the dreaded Civipedia. Ever since Civ 3, when people say, it's like, okay, Jeff, there's a lot of text in this game. There's about 40,000 words. I just have to suppress an eye roll, where, we had 250,000 to 500,000 words in Civ 3 to get localized, to get proofed, to make understandable. And that was probably one of those early challenges that I've never really had anything sort of get up to that level of complexity.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you started off on the most complex. In that, and I definitely hope we get into more detail on the production side of it, because it seems like a difficult game, especially in the era, to be a producer on, because of all of the complexities in the simulation. It's not like it's a linear game with a beginning, middle, and end, and you can kind of close down one level and know that level is done and blah, 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 And part of it is, as Brett and I talked about on the podcast, it's because we haven't made games like this. So I think, at least speaking for myself, there's a big mystery from the development side of things about how these types of games are made. And I did go into the manual after maybe the second episode or so. And as you know, because you listen to some of the podcasts, like, we're notoriously bad at not reading the manual before we start. And it usually
it's our history of working on console games, I think, at this point.
Yeah. But I did go in, but there's sort of like the deeper, I was calling it the spreadsheet behind the game in previous episodes. The deeper sides of the games, I feel like the manual still didn't give me, like the almost the statistics and stuff. It would describe concepts, but it didn't give me, like, how happiness really works. You know what I mean?
And I think your diplomacy discussion from a couple of episodes ago is a good example of that, which was assessing what a fair deal was and assessing I'm in a position that I should be asking for more. I think those learnings were intentionally meant to be gained over multiple sessions, that you would play the game over and over and over and accrue it, almost roguelike the experience to know when you should and shouldn't do things. But I would say a lot of the wargaming culture that, I talk a little bit about in Baltimore, that was a culture of like risk takers and very aggressive people who tried things. Like, I went to enough gaming conventions where I just got schooled by grognards and huge beards who were audacious and took the initiative. And I think if you played Civilization that way, it would kind of reward you often, if not with explicit victory, but a clear lesson for you to exploit in future playthroughs.
Yeah, it definitely is a repeat playthrough kind of game for sure. Yeah, you're learning trial by fire, and I think that's where the one more turn itis gets into it. I forgot to bring this up on the series, but it hit me even harder as I kind of went down a very deep Beyond Earth hole after we finished. I really love early game in Civ because I'm so OCD and I love like setting everything up. You know what I mean? Like, there's the early to mid game, and it's that, like, at least for me, maybe because I haven't played as many hours, hundreds of hours as I should. But that's the section of the game that I felt like I was getting more masterful with. And so that one more turn and that sort of like repeat learning over the early game, like setting the Civ up multiple times, I really got good at that. And it just multiplies so much beyond that, just exponentially. Once you get into late game, it just kind of runs away from you. And I had some of the stories about world wars breaking out and kind of things just kind of going down the tubes at points, just because I get overwhelmed. But I just love that sort of, perfecting, something like the early game specifically, because it's like you have so much, you can really, every knob you can tune on that stuff.
And you also have sort of you also have sort of a pipeline of goals, right? Is that because you have multiple cities and they're pursuing different things at different times, that one more turn also comes from like, oh, well, this turn, this thing finished, so now I've got a new goal that I'm pursuing, or like I've set up this like naval invasion or whatever that does take several turns, or there's just a lot of different things that are taking, I don't know, almost different prime numbered amounts of turns. So there's always something happening where you're like, oh, cool, next turn I'll be able to do this thing, right? And it's a bunch of goals that you've got in your head.
That was very much intentional on Sid's part, and he frequently talked about short, mid, and long range goals, and you should always have those. And so short range is building a unit. Medium range is conquering a city. Long range is trying to win by space race. There was always something for you to shift gears to as you accomplished one goal. There was always another one just waiting for you to sort of redirect, and the pursuit of that one would cause new short-term goals to occur. Sid is one of those designers or developers that is sort of worth the reputation that he has. There's plenty of people that say don't meet your heroes, but when you meet Sid, you can absolutely see how the success he's enjoyed came about. And probably the best example of that was the game that Soren talked briefly about, which was the Dinosaurs game. The Dinosaurs game, literally, no exaggeration, over a weekend, and it was the third incarnation of the various attempts, turned into Sid Meier's Sim Golf. And it was, he was just messing around with it, and he had spent all this time on a number of different approaches to Dinosaurs. He had tried other interesting little side projects. He had a really great traffic pattern program or prototype. We tried to make Pirates into an Old West game. He would take these little detours, but he would always come back to Dinosaurs because it had that ingredient that all of his games have, which is that you have some possibility of understanding it before you play it. Like the manual for Civilization in a lot of ways is in your brain because you don't know necessarily what this Paris is about specifically, but you know invading Paris has this certain weight behind it. Or you guys mentioned invading Machu Picchu. There's a sort of built-in understanding, and he really thought Dinosaurs had that same sort of hook to it. But he literally turned it into a golf design course within the Sims franchise, and that's how it eventually shipped. And it's just, I cannot think of anyone else who is that honest with themselves, that fast at standing things up, that dedicated to those core principles of fun, and seeing that transition from it didn't go on to being a huge success, but it shipped. And back in those days, and even to this day, shipping is still, and certainly as a producer, shipping is what it's all about.
Yeah, shipping is a skill. Sim Golf's a terrific title. I don't know if you ever played that one, Tim, but that is a good one. And I had no idea that those were related in any way whatsoever.
There is shared code in Dinosaurs under the Sim Golf umbrella.
Fantastic. That is amazing.
So we're up to you're on Civ 3, you're producing. What is what and you mentioned, and actually I think it's cool that you're mentioning that there's sort of a lot of crossover with QA, because the QA process for a Civ game is also baffling to us, or at least to me. I think we brought that up too. But what can you give us just a little bit of the day in the life of, from a production side, of something like this game, which seems so complex, seems so layered, and so many systems that you would have to QA and you'd have to produce. And, in Soren, luckily for the, having these back to back, we have Soren's perspective of, for instance, we talked about AI and sort of his approach to that and adding features and what things were missing from 1 and 2. So what was the day-to-day kind of interactions you had with Soren and the others when it comes to helping them, realize, like you said, realize the vision they were going after?
I'd say a lot of it was playtesting, and not necessarily in the QA sense of playtesting, but the sort of daily, high tempo, high iterative playtesting, which is, I tried this, let's all bang on it and see what we think. Probably one of the key elements of Firaxis' success from my perspective, and it was all based on the model that Sid created, which is you want your lead designer to be your lead programmer. That combination is the most efficient prototyping configuration you can come up with. The iteration time is off the charts. They basically are so self-sufficient that you feed them some art here and there. And for the most part, they are a one-man band creating the content. This was probably the last 2D game I ever worked on. I think everything after this was 3D. It could very well have been Firaxis' last 2D. I can't remember if Civ 4 was 3D or not.
But yeah, it was.
It was. So the content burden was so much simpler for a game of this style than contemporary games that you really could have one or two people just iterate quickly on it. There were other people on the project, a guy named Pat Dawson, who went on to a very long career at Blizzard, Casey O'Toole, who I believe is still at Firaxis. I could be very wrong about that. There was a small team of engineers that were all working together, but as far as the actual intermingling of the systems and how everything was decided upon and implemented, it was pretty loose. We didn't say have a ticket in whatever database we had back then, and for all we know, it was an Excel spreadsheet that said implement borders like in Alpha Centauri, and someone crossed that off. I would say we definitely had a bit more of what you would think of as a traditional pipeline in the art front. And that was the first time I started to fall in love with a universally loathed piece of software called Microsoft Project. Microsoft Project for me, though, should you make yourself a discipline of that cult and learn all its ins and outs, provide something that virtually no other piece of software out there does, and none that I've found to the same degree it does 25 years later, which is the ability to make a small change and then see how that ripples out butterfly effect throughout the rest of the project. So I got pretty good on a established unit pipeline. So like each unit took 2 weeks, and then it went to animation and da-da-da-da-da. You had a very easy to quantify pipeline, unlike design, unlike the other systems. And I would be able to predict, say, 2 or 3 months out what the number of units that we would have, the number of Civ heads, Civ leader heads we would have, where these various assets were. And that was an early success of mine that they didn't have before. Tim Train was a phenomenal producer and one that I learned a lot from before the air quotes big, huge defection, which is when Soren came on board. But at the same time, I don't think he was doing that kind of sort of modeling of taking data of what had happened and then extrapolating against a calendar moving forward. And that's something that ever since then, some people prioritize, some studios prioritize, some don't. But there's very few people out there that I've been able to interact with that don't find value in the ability to sort of call a shot 2 to 3 months ahead of time and then, be held accountable to whether or not you hit that target. Those were all skills I really started to begin to value at Firaxis. And again, because I had the privilege of working with the team there, get better at doing it as well.
Yeah, that measurement and feedback back into the sort of process of like, okay, we gave this artist this thing, and it took this long to do whatever, that was really starting then. This is like 20 years ago now, and that was definitely one of those things. It's, as a programmer, it's always been harder to schedule to some degree until you've actually done it once, because until you've done it one time, you don't really know how long it's going to take to do a programming task often, if it's not a well-known thing, especially if it's new. So no,
I would say
it's great that you like had that kind of split perspective for like your programmer designer who is like, okay, he's going to go do the thing. And that's going to spit out something that I can schedule to, because I'll know what the pieces are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was something that I even saw within the art department, is that you had to treat each resource differently. That, there were some people who, if you asked them how long something was going to take, padded the hell out of it, and they would always come in under. And then there were people who would be constantly under it. Well, after 4 or 5 stabs at it, you start to see the people who are constantly over, if you're keeping track of the actual duration of those things, and you just need to add sort of a per resource modifier. And that's one of the things that's so much more difficult in the large scale teams, is there's such a desire to unify and treat everyone the same, just because having that little, I have to double his and I can subtract 5% from this guy and all that for 100-man team is a kind of overhead that I'm not sure any production department would sanely spend their time doing. By that same token, like when it came to Sid, when it came to Brian, when it came to Soren and the other engineers, for the most part, you were rewarded for neglecting them. And that's something I've discovered ever since that I really value in engineers and designers. Is there's some that if you leave them alone and then you come back when they said come back and they're like, oh, I need another 2 weeks. Well, that guy is punishing me for neglecting him. But you have that core, and those are the people I generally like working with the most, is that I can just sort of say, you got it? They say, I got it. You know where you're going? I know where I'm going. And then you come back, and not only did they do what they did 10 times or 2 times more. And often the overhead of production, doing stand-up, status meetings, we tried every status meeting mechanism known to man at Firaxis. All that tax on their time where they could be coding generally didn't give you any predictive insight to when they'd be done. All you did was burgle time that they could be moving things forward, could be discovering things. And
I'm nodding.
For me, the idea that this is very much a more recent perspective I've got, but that game production is a tax, and you better get something for your tax dollars. And the people who seem to have the most resentment against producers are sort of the people that I feel are taxed the most, and then still hit a pothole metaphorically every time they drive to work that day.
That's funny. Yeah, we used to say between some top-notch programmers I've worked with that production requests are a denial of service attack on productivity.
Yeah.
So.
Oh boy, right. Well, yeah. So then I guess my kind of next category that you've hit a little bit of, but because there were so many sort of expansion packs and like Civ 3 and it really any Civ game is not just over when it launches. And we talked a little bit about this with Soren and especially of the era, because live games weren't really a thing. But I think Firaxis specifically, and this franchise specifically, was sort of doing live in a way before live was really so hot as it is now. As a producer and any of the sort of playtesting and QA stuff you're doing, do you have any recollection of like from the beginning of starting on Civ as a producer, shipping the initial game, and then over the course of the time after that, and really, I guess, really your time at Firaxis after that, like how did you start changing and evolving as a producer over the course of like a project that isn't just about the launch, you know what I mean? And beyond.
Yeah, I'd say, a lot of a key aspect of games as a service that I've discovered since then working in some free-to-play games is the involvement of the community. And I would always say that the involvement of the community at that era was paid a certain amount of lip service, but there just really wasn't any mechanism for that feedback to come back in because, again, we're sending discs around over the mail, using mail and the like. So the QA effort on Civ 3 was the first one that Firaxis did any form of public beta. And, to some degree, like all the Civ games, even the first one had involvement from people not on the dev team that the dev team trusted. Alan Emmerich at Computer Gaming World very famously was a key element of the Bruce Shelley, Sid Meier loop on the first Civ. And so we really wanted to try to get these experts out there, in particular the Civ II experts, involved in the game. I would say that was, a very time-consuming thing because we would do watermarks on the game. But each watermark was specific to the person we were sending it to. And the only way we knew how to do that at the time was we would do a separate build for each person we sent it to with this key combination that would cause their name to come up. So if it ever leaked, we would know where it came from. Wow. And so we did a decent amount of just sort of security because it was the first time. We didn't know if this was just a gateway to these things showing up on Usenet, the game, or if this was going to be really critical feedback. And it turned out to be sort of right down the middle. The game never leaked. But because we were using forums and there's a certain risk in the direct interaction with your users from, assorted members of the team, that we got some good ideas. And it was great to hear how in Civ 4 they took it to the next logical step, which is bringing them on site, where then you can do sort of, and Epic would do this as well, where we would bring in the most active users and then you would just sort of do a marathon of 24, 48 hours where you would just play the game and talk and have direct access to the developers proper. And that worked. That worked like gangbusters. I would say the QA effort on Civ 3 was also complicated by the fact that it was the first non-Electronic Arts QA effort that Firaxis did. So since Gettysburg and Alpha Centauri were with EA, and in particular Origin QA, where I had roots, we were able to pretty effectively QA those complicated games. And I just as a quick side, I would say, coming from flight sims, I was very much under the impression the way to QA a game was to do everything possible in the game before you shipped it as part of a release checklist. And as you guys have pointed out, you can't do that with Civ. You can't what if in the last 2 weeks of development, a crash came in where Russia nukes India, the game will crash 100% of the time. There's no way for us to actually catch that, where today that would be an interesting challenge, and I'm sure there's much better options for it. But at the time, I did not know how to QA that other than the sort of tried and true do everything. And then there was the sort of usability testing aspect of it, which was more, did it work? And then the gameplay, is it fun? Is it balanced QA portion? And so besides not having my old Origin compadres working on it, we had a pretty complicated QA effort where 1/4 of it was the public beta, 1/4 of it was a company in Baltimore called Absolute Quality Incorporated, who had a long-standing relationship. I think they were founded by ex-MicroProse guys, and Firaxis, when they first started, they were in the Absolute Quality offices before they got their own offices. So there was a long-standing relationship between them. So we had Public QA, AQI, Atari, which was the new publisher and not one that had deep institutional knowledge about PC games. And then we had our small on-site QA. And so sort of juggling all those together, certainly in the back half, became, most of what I did. And the game, I would say all Firaxis's games up to that point shipped in okay ? Bug fix status. And I don't think Civ 3 was any different. While I'd say Soren highlighted the big balance and gameplay changing patches, we had plenty of what I would call hot fixes. Most of those, of course, you're either pulling down from a BBS or we're mailing you a 3.5-inch disc directly. But for there was a number of post-launch crises, multiple crises that we had to manage, and sometimes that took the form of major revisions in an expansion pack, and sometimes it was just straight up defect patches.
Yeah, I mean, for the audience at the time, we've kind of talked about like audio cards. I mean, that would have been more of a solved problem, I think, by the time Civ 3 came out. But graphics cards and driver variances were huge, and I mean, at that time, I was glad that I switched to console at the beginning of my career because it's the one machine. And with a PC, you have 100 PCs sitting in an office in front of you, and you probably have 150 configurations or something. Yeah. It's madness. It's very difficult to test for all. It continues to be a problem today to some degree.
As a lifelong gamer, probably the ones I have the most sort of cringe about is when game developers I really respect would write in complaining about bugs, and I wouldn't be able to help them. And so one of the developers of Archon, which is an old Apple II game I obsessed with, John Freeman, reached out and said, "Hey, I really love the game, but I just can't get over this." And I wasn't able to help him, and tech support wasn't able to help him. And I just disappointed one of my heroes as he slunk off, not able to play the game that he had bought anymore. I felt terrible.
Well, you can play it now. It's totally solid.
How many patches later?
Yeah.
So I do want to reserve, at the end, I want to talk a little bit about post-Civ, because you've had such an interesting career in some other places, and maybe we can kind of build up to, kind of ending on, I don't know. I don't want you to sort of, you've actually peppered in some of the Jeff Moore gems that I love throughout the episode. But kind of just concluding on sort of, your tenets or sort of like some of your core philosophies that have kind of become tried and true. And it sounds like a lot of them did begin, or you've learned a lot of stuff from Civ 3 even back then. But so you went to Epic after this, and sort of how did things start changing for you as a producer?
Well, I would say that Epic had shared a lot of sort of cultural DNA with Firaxis, even though there was very little cross-pollination between the two studios. But both were completely driven by playtests. That was the beginning, middle, and end of what they thought game development was about. And so at Firaxis, a lot of the playtests were kind of informal, and you either had to be there when the build popped or go to lunch with the person to know it was available. Where at Epic, it was a little bit more militant, that you play tested every day, and you had a wrap-up meeting after every playtest every day. And if the build was not playable for the playtest, that was a crisis. You could be 2 years from ship, but if you can't play the build for a day or 2 days or 3 days, like, what are we doing exactly? And that was something that Sid really educated me on, which is, I don't know if he ever articulated this, but it was certainly the general operating rule, which is 2 weeks after the project started, after people were billing to that project, you're having playtests. And it can be incredibly simple playtests. It can be Soren. I saw him playtest a game on a whiteboard with Post-its, and it was a multiplayer strategy game, turn-based strategy game. And it turned out you can very effectively prototype or playtest that type of game on a big whiteboard with Post-its for the units and the whiteboard chopped up into the spaces of the field. That took the form of pen and paper playtests of computer systems, but it was a quicker way to prototype back then. Playtest. And so at Epic, it really drove home just how fast you can go if you just focus on what's on screen and what are we going to do in the next 24 hours to make what's on screen better. That kind of perspective is probably the thing that pays the most dividends in my career as I float around on studios, because so many people believe that there is a smart enough idea that if you just implement it, it will be perfect. And it explains a lot of games out there that I've worked with people since then where I'm like, oh, that's how that happened, is that you shipped your first implementation. And really you want to ship your 518th implementation of any one feature so that you have the chance to say, wouldn't it be cool if so many game development studios, because of the culture or the aggression of the timeline or the deal, that the answer is always no to wouldn't it be cool ifs. You want the answer to be wouldn't it be cool if to be yes, 80% of the time, in order to find those gems. So many great features are not the feature that were asked for, but a tangent ricochet off another feature that one playtester thought of, whipped up, and that became the signature pillar of the game. And so just trying to predict that it's empty calories. It can burgle you again from time that could be spent doing. And doing is how you're going to get stuff up on screen.
Love it. Wisdom.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's very, very well said. At Bethesda, it was great games are played, not made. It's just the belief that you get the thing on the screen, you throw as much spaghetti as you can at the wall, is kind of the approach there. A little bit different. And whatever sticks, right? That's your game.
I'd say another key element that Epic really drilled into me, and it probably has a little less connection because of the style of games between Firaxis and Epic, which is whatever the player is doing 90% of the time, you should never have any hesitation about spending time on that. And so for Epic games and many of the games since then, which I've done, which are, first-person shooters and third-person shooter kind of games, it's moving and shooting. And so many times you're like, well, I really want to spend time on this extra system that could possibly change the way inventory works. Okay, sure, there's a role for that. But if someone is fired up, willing to put in heroics on their own time to make something involving using a gun, using a sword, moving, jumping, something that you're just constantly doing in the game, inevitably that's time well spent. A lot of times there's sort of, and again, that's harder to apply these days than it was in the past, because you look at games like Halo and there's at a minimum 3 major features in there that you could say people are spending most of their time on, and you could justify spending time on it that way. But if you really boil it down to if you're videotaping someone playing this game or recording them, what is on screen most of the time, and if it's them traversing a level, don't go and spend a lot of time on the crafting mechanism. Feel free to make that good, but if you have to make a choice between scarce resources, spending it on what the player is actually doing for a majority of his time, simplistic though it may sound, it's a good razor for making decisions often in times where it's kind of hard often to know what is the highest urgency and highest priority.
Yeah, that's a good one too. And I know you say there's a comparison between, the games Epic was making and the games Firaxis was making. I think that still, applies, but in kind of a different way to a Civilization 3 kind of game, because, the thing that, yes, the player is doing many things at once when you're sort of spinning the plates of that game. But in a way, the simulating a civilization is the core of it, and expanding that civilization. And, there's still sort of like a core there that I think should be the focus. Like, for instance,
you're interacting with the sim, and you want those interactions to feel good. Whether that is getting information about that, or which is a thing that's been refined, or just making directions, doing orders and things like that.
Right.
I would also say that oftentimes you discover that users are spending their time doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And so using Civ as an example, worker management is something that in the back quarter of that game, you are spending a huge amount of time on worker management. So does that mean we should make worker management the funnest part of the game? Probably not. Probably the problem is that they're spending that much time doing that thing that is not what the actual fantasy is all about.
Right.
Yeah, fair point.
Yeah, one example that I'd give comparing my time with 3 to my time with 5 and Beyond Earth is the advisors in 3 were a lot more front and center, and very present, and kind of tried to guide you that way. And I think for the era and for that sort of third iteration, that probably was a good thing for people coming in, especially new players. But in 5 and in Beyond Earth, the advisors are essentially integrated into, like, they have an advisor screen, but I never open it. They're integrated into the UI, so it's sort of like this thing that you could see someone spending a lot of time on an advisor system that really wasn't necessary for the core part of the game. The game isn't about going to a separate advisor screen and deep diving and talking to these advisors for forever. They just decided to sort of creep that through the game automatically, so you don't even realize that they're there. Same system, but it's not something you'd spend a lot of resources on, for sure. So in our final moments, I do want to ask, because we could have some, maybe some budding producers out there or what have you. You're
or just some people trying to escape QA. Tim.
Yes,
exactly. More wisdom from Jeff. You're 25 years in. You've had some pretty big roles over the last 5 to 8 years or what have you, including something called Senior Director of Project Management. And so for all 3 of us, we've been doing this for a while, but I do want to kind of talk about a producer's life, in the phase that you're in now, with something like being at, I think that one was at Kabam. What does your life evolve into, if you can kind of, sort of summarize a life of sort of something, somebody at that scale? What is the day-to-day, or not even the day-to-day, but sort of like how does your head change when you become Senior Director of Project Management?
Yeah, sure. It's a bit of a trick question for me, because titles in production are very elastic. So producer at Electronic Arts famously had always been more of a creative director role, and they had development directors who I would consider a producer.
Right.
I would say that role was given to me by a dear friend named Aaron Loeb as part of sort of an incentive package to come in and save a game called Star Wars Uprising and get it out, because we had a very hard, immovable deadline, which is when the episode 7 was going to be released. And so they had to get it out by that time. So that was part of that. But ultimately, I have been doing the same job for the last 20 years, which is cigar chomping sergeant from a World War II movie. I'm the guy who says the men need shoes. I don't pick I don't pick the hill. But once the hill is picked out to me, I'm like, okay, we're going to go do this. You flank left, you run up the middle, you throw your grenades. Basically, I'm a very tactical producer. But because of the number of mistakes that I've made in my field, I consider myself an expert in that I've more or less run out of mistakes to make in my field, that I can go and apply those lessons at a very large scale. And I would say the Kabam project was the biggest project I've ever worked on, which was 120 people. So it was a massive effort to get a mobile Star Wars game out. But I was running the stand-ups, and I was running the predictive scheduling, and I was doing all the things that a line producer would do. I just had a title to give me the sort of unambiguous authority to run it as I saw fit at that scale. I'm fortunate in that I really did discover a buzz, something that really kept me electrified about that kind of in the trenches production, that I will say it has to be somewhat career limiting, in the sense that I never want to go into what a traditional executive producer or director would do. At Free Range, I am an executive producer, but by no metric am I doing what an executive producer does. I run the stand-ups, I do daily playtests, I bang on builds, I make sure people have what they need, and those are the same things I've been doing since I've been not an associate producer necessarily, but just a rank and file producer. The advantage of thinking that way, which is do tactical stuff with the authority of someone, with the authority of a general, for lack of a better term, that just really works for me, because so much of my focus, often for very either academic producers or producers from very different game development cultures than I come from, my process can seem either incredibly simplistic or dangerous or irresponsible, because it is really built upon a foundation of trusting people to want to do good work. I found a lot of compatible philosophies with Ed Catmull at Pixar, who very much says things like, a producer's job is not to prevent mistakes from happening. A producer's job is to, when a mistake does happen, from people doing their best, that it's no big deal, that it's just a bump that they go over. And that often is really only doable when you're sort of at the top of the production org chart. That focus, though, is something that just time and time again, studios are incredibly thirsty for, and need someone to come in and execute without necessarily having to play that political game. And for me, that's a comfort zone that, even till today, I'm still able to find employment doing, irregardless of what the job title says. But I will say that was a very choice job title, and I certainly have a stack of those Kabam business cards laying around. And I guess if I ever got pulled over by a cop or something, I'd say, well, here's my business card, and try to make a good impression. But I will say, I by very few metrics would I be able to do that role for someone who didn't know what I did, but those people all know what I do, and they generally find a lot of value in it.
Yeah, I fully admit it was intended to be a trick question, because I know exactly what you're. I know what you're.
Meetings and stock market valuations and mergers and acquisitions. My strengths.
Yeah, right. Because I knew that that's what you did do. And that's why I love that title exists for you, because I know that story, but I wanted the audience to hear sort of that. There are these sort of like preconceived notions about, getting into executive positions and what that does and changes. And for some people, that's what they want, maybe, and that's fine. Of course, there's no judgment there. But I think when it comes to making games, one of the refreshing things that I loved working with Jeff on is the attitude you heard over the course of this episode. of just what it means to make freaking games, and that's been his focus. And I think it's been a great conversation for that reason, Jeff. So thank you for your wisdom and your cigar chomping and everything from today.
Absolutely. It was a real good trade. I'm sorry, Brett.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you so much. If you are pulled over, maybe just point at the 5 stars and the general cap. I'm just saying they probably won't go for the title so much as the brass. But yeah, that was a really fantastic and wide-ranging discussion where I've got a number of things I've written down here that I need to follow up with Tim on afterwards in the post-show. So thank you so much.
Hey, thanks a lot, guys. And the last thing I wanted to mention was Brett mentioned he had done a lot of Civilization playing late at night with insomnia. That is a time-honored way to play Civilization. Like the key to breaking insomnia is to shift gears out of your current thinking, and nothing will do that like, Gandhi raiding along your coastline. So I just wanted to say I've done a huge amount of insomnia Civ gameplay and have a certain amount of nostalgia for that. So that's how you do it.
No doubt. Much of our audience does as well. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Welcome back from the break. I just want to point out, as I pointed out after we stopped recording, that I was not the first to say grognard.
Nope. Yeah. And I shouldn't be surprised, to be honest.
I love it. No, there was a lot of really great stuff in that conversation. He has a number of gems that he kind of throws out there that I loved to hear about. And I had a number of things I wrote down to come back to. But there was so much to cover with Civ in general. It has been that way.
Yeah.
But I love the idea of like production, of there being a tax on development and making sure you're getting something for that tax was the insight. Like, that's fantastic. And also just, being so playtest driven and the places I've been that have been very playtest driven, and how successful that can be, as well as iteration loops and things like that. It was just a lot of great wisdom there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's he, kind of dawned on me after I worked with Jeff, at my second tour of duty at LucasArts, that it's sort of surprising to me that it's not surprising. I guess it feels unfortunate to me that I hadn't met more producers that were like him, because I feel like there's so many, and I'm not trying to, speak down to the producers I have worked, because I've worked with a lot of great producers and everyone approaches it from their own perspective, and each perspective has value here and there, especially depending on the project. But for me, at least, a lot of his approach made an impression on me because it is sort of simple in a way. He comes at it from a very logical, like, of course, this is what you should do. And the thing that he and I, even though we spent 2+ years together, the thing that we never actually talked about going to lunch or something like this is some of the stuff that actually came up on the podcast. And I never really heard the stories about how some of the genesis of his thinking, where it came from Firaxis and Epic and stuff. And it kind of makes, it makes complete sense to me now, because of the culture of those studios and Origin, I guess I'd throw in there too. His upbringing was very influential on where he is today. And I think he himself as a person, comes out of, you can kind of tell, he is naturally taking on that cigar chomping, sergeant. And I think that's sort of his persona, but yeah, it just was refreshing working with him on it. And I wanted to, it was a nice, coincidence that he had worked on Civ III. So it was a good excuse to have him on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, one of the things that we talked about with the other producer we've ever talked to, which was Lulu Lemaire, was the degree to which producers kind of come up in a culture and they do what they think is right. I mean, it's like, I mean, there was no, unlike, like even at LucasArts, all of the roles, it feels to me, except for production, had structure that helped them become better at their jobs, which is not to say that we didn't have good producers at LucasArts, because we did. But they had to find their own way to it a lot more so, I think, than the other disciplines did. Right. I came in as a programmer, but I had whole kinds of, studio structure around programming. Same for artists and, QA. We had a great QA department that trained QA and what their job was, but there wasn't really somebody doing that for production. And I think that has probably been true across a lot of the industry. As more money got involved, production became, at least in part, sort of the Suits way of saying, hey, let me keep tabs on this project to some degree, right? I mean, I think that that's where some of the antipathy you hear sometimes towards production come from. And frankly, a great producer means everything. I mean, it's so helpful to have someone to rely on to help you clear things out of the way, or to help you make it not a big deal, to give you a space in which it's okay to fail every now and again, as he was pointing out that, sometimes you're going to reach for something that's not going to quite work. That's okay. Right? We do creative work. That's going to happen. If it's not happening, you're probably not doing anything interesting. So a lot really to love about that. And an interesting place for that to have come from as well, especially, it being so nearby to me, having met some of the folks that have worked with Jeff over the years. So pretty wild. Yeah.
And he is full of gems. Like he's just a great person, hilarious person to talk to about this stuff. And I mean, you can tell from the episode, like I know very few people who are so excited about production, you know what I mean? And just like the way that he talks about it, like like designers talk about design, like he has found his thing. And I think his words were like, there's a buzz, that he gets from it. And when you work with him, you see it because, notoriously on the game that we were working on together, everybody on the team played the game every day. You know what I mean? Like that, and he became a pain in the butt for people, especially like the shy artist who just wanted to stay in their, in their office and make art. And it's like, but it did make the game better, and, people would start off grumpy, but then over a couple of weeks, they were looking forward to it, because they were playing what they were making. And they weren't used to it. They weren't used to something like that. So, but he just is infectious. He just has this sort of like, nope, we're going to do this. And he just kind of goes through it and charges the hill, as he said.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been lucky to encounter people like that. I mean, we worked with Darren Stinnett, and and Darren was very much that way. I mean, there were times where Darren would say, hey, I need you to do this. And I'd be like, that's really not my thing. He's like, yeah, but I don't care. I'd like you to do that. And, you've seen, I can remember like recording B-roll footage or something like that. He's like, I want you to do some B-roll footage to show off the, what the AI can do. I was like, really? I mean, I've got all these tasks, whatever, and him doing, you've seen reels, you know what it looks like. It's fine. Just do it, and just saying, hey, this is what we're doing now, is definitely a helpful thing. Like that's a person who knows that there's room in the schedule for me to spend time doing that. And it also,
and the value of it.
Yeah. And it's a thing that that you grow from often, certainly early in my career. But yeah, I mean, that's hugely important.
And now you produce a podcast.
And now I produce a podcast. There is nothing like game production in what I do for this podcast every week. Nothing at all.
I just
other than I have to talk to you.
Editing, and putting a show together. Anyway.
Yeah. No, it was a fascinating conversation. I'm glad, we are so lucky with our interviews, and whenever we've had a couple on the same game, that's also super cool. Yeah. Just because we get those different perspectives, and Jeff very helpfully had, or Jeffrey, I should say, had very helpfully listened to the Soren interview as well. So he kind of was like, oh yeah, and Soren was referring to this. So you get that kind of, another lens on what was going on. A long distance lens at this point, many years, but it's still super, super great. So many thanks to Jeff. Many thanks to Jeff. And I'm glad you brought him on.
Yeah.
So cool. Let's move on to feedback, and then we'll talk about our next game after that. Before we do the feedback, I do want to say, because I meant to say it last week, is that we're on Spotify and Stitcher now. When we started the podcast, in that first year or so, both of those were like a little bit more closed garden. I don't think Spotify even had podcasts at the time. When they finally did, you had to be, I don't know, you had to talk to somebody there or something, and they didn't talk to us, so that never happened. But now that's much more open. So thank you to Derek Hoy, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Derek, and Josh Harding. I think I got that one. For emailing and asking about those this year and getting me off my butt to do it. So there was some actual producer stuff right there that I had to do.
Nice. Good work.
But yeah, if there are other services and whatever, I don't mind doing the work. I just need to know about them, because I have a thing I use, and that's all I ever use, and I'm not tied into all that other stuff. I did want to also, though, say in connection with those in particular, they may run ads, and if you hear ads on those services, or any service for that matter, they have nothing to do with us. We are entirely self-supported. So if you do hear ads that are in any way problematic for you, let us know about that. But in general, and we can see what we can do about it, but in general, we have nothing to do with the ads if there are ever ads associated. I want to mention, because I know that those can do that on occasion. There's usually, I think, just before and after things, but who knows. Anyway, so that's done. That's the producer talk done. Thank you very much. Why don't you go with your first email from Oliver? Kind of a long one. We got some long ones this time. We'll see how we do.
Okay. Darn dogs.
Yep. Welcome, June.
Yep. The whole neighborhood is going out. We'll have a little help with them downstairs, but I guess not. Calling out my wife, I guess, on here. Okay, so we have designer and developer ? Yes, please. From Oliver Uvman. I guess I'll pronounce it that way.
Sure.
Hello. Listened to every episode and often felt like mailing, but only now getting around to it. Congrats on the bicentennial. Regarding whether it's good for a designer to also be a programmer or not, I think there are a lot of good reasons for either be or be not. You already covered good points for be not last episode. I wanted to add some reasons why the multi-discipline approach can be good. First, fast prototyping is very useful. I heard stories from IRC Soren Johnson about Sid Meier's programming skills. He would gather feedback on Civ during the day and be ready with an adjusted new build of the game the next day. He'd also go through tons of prototypes of different kinds of games before bringing promising ones to the team. I heard this from Soren's Designer Notes podcast, which is almost as good as yours, but sadly not as active or consistent. They also interview a lot of board game designers, which I hope is of interest to many of your listeners. Yeah, everyone should definitely check out that podcast.
Yeah, it's called Designer Notes. It's on a less frequent schedule than we're on, a pretty regular schedule, and Soren's more, as I have time to interview people, because he also runs his own studio, et cetera. So he's a busy man.
It's part of
a good, and very
Thumbs,
deep
right?
divey with individual. It is part of the Idle Thumbs network, but you can get it anywhere you get your podcast. So
yeah. He goes on, these days there are lots of prototyping tools and game making frameworks that you can use with just a little programming knowledge. So any learning effort should be quite useful. Really, knowing variables, conditionals, and loops is almost all one needs. Functions should also be learned, as it will only take a day or so, and will save a huge amount of effort down the line. The first three can be learned quickly using Scratch, and he gives a website. It's an MIT program, right?
yes, it is. Yep.
After that, I recommend braving the waters of typos and syntax errors and starting with some text-based programming environments. Writing GML code in GameMaker looks like a good starting point that will let you have fun and see results quickly. Note, I haven't tried it myself. Second, knowing what is difficult and what's easy is not always bad. Filtering out impossible ideas can save time, but might limit creativity. The other side of the coin is that it's great to know about existing good and easy solutions to common problems. I can't count the number of times I've had designers ask me for very expensive features to be added, only to figure out simple and easy solutions when talking to them about what their goals and problems really are. When asked for new features, I've taken the habit of always asking designers how the feature will be used by the user, what problems they're intending to solve, and what the goals are. If you're working with less experienced programmers who don't ask you this, it's very useful if you expose this information to them up front. This brings me to the most important part. Third, communication. Podcast already covered some of this, but I want to emphasize it. As a programmer, the best product managers and designers I've worked with were those who had at least a few weeks of spare time coding experience. This helped them a lot in understanding complexities, understanding simplified explanations, etc. I think it is also helpful. It also helped them trust us programmers when we told them something was hard. Probably they were also good to work with because they were naturally curious and enjoyed knowing more than just the surface of it's possible or it's not possible. Curiosity always helps. Fourth and least important, some great games have been made on the basis of technical innovations of varying difficulty. Examples include incredibly hard graphics work for Doom, use of voxels in Minecraft, making it easy for players to modify their environment, portals in Portal, or particle physics in Noita. Many gameplay mechanics wouldn't have been thought of without knowing about or thinking of new unused technical features. Of course, most successful games don't have a new technology as their hook for popularity, but it's one useful road of many. This will usually be the domain of the lead programmer, though. As a designer, having enough interest in basic knowledge to talk at length with your lead programmer is probably essential for this kind of project. As a non-expert in rendering or geometric algebra, there are certainly times when my eyes have been opened by super expert programmers. I've often marveled at one coworker in particular who could make the impossible seem easy by the way of math. This always reminds me that curiously listening, caring, and trying to understand is so important. Wow, epic.
Yeah. A lot of stuff there. Yeah, I mean, I would say I covered all this in the first thing I had to say about whether or not designers should be programmers. And it was this. It depends. So I would agree that a lot of these things are super helpful, but often for different sorts of teams. Like, something like fast prototyping, I find just as useful as, and actually Jeff gave a great example of this, Soren, prototyping a multiplayer network game with Post-its on a whiteboard. Like, perfect. Paper prototyping to me is just as useful in many types of games, not all games, obviously. Again, it depends. But in general, yeah, I mean, I totally agree that it can be very beneficial to have that. I think that at the scale that you and I have most worked, I personally would prefer less limiting. I think it's valuable to have the sort of cross-pollination of the two, but communication, which is one of the things he underlines, is I think that the most key thing there. It's just that the communication loop is very, very short if they're the same person. So,
yeah.
Any other thoughts there?
No, I think I've some of the similar thoughts that I had, I think, when we talked about this before. And like I mentioned then, I think there are definitely times when I wish I had some base understanding of certain concepts to really make the communication step more more useful and just kind of have more connection there with the programmer. And some of that is just me feeling bad, that I don't understand certain things. And I feel like that communication is best when there's trust there, and that there's a sort of a mutual trust about things. And I think if you spend the time to get a little bit of base knowledge there, I think it shows that you do care about what somebody else is doing. And I think that goes really with any of the disciplines, right? I mean, one of the biggest challenges of team management that I've always felt is these weird divides that disciplines can have in general. Yeah. I mean, he and we have been talking about the programmer designer because Soren was on and stuff, but every discipline has sort of like their niche that they stay in, and there's different terms, there's different ways they talk about things, they think differently, and one of the craziest things about, I'm sure we've covered this at some point over the 4 years, but one of the craziest things about game development is you have the weirdest set of disciplines all mashed together to make a thing, you have tech, you have art, and you have production, you have designers. And in some cases, some of our disciplines are not even found in other places, in other media, right? And often in film, you don't have the tech element. Sometimes you do, but you don't really have the tech element. So you're shipping software with these highly creative people, and it's just a crazy, crazy thing. So I think for any discipline to reach out to the other disciplines with some base knowledge can be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Although, the other thing about communication is that I have seen communication used as deliberately obfuscatory, right? Somebody is definitely out there to wave some body part around and show that they know something that you don't. And I honestly think at that point, it's okay to be just like, explain to me and explain to me and explain to me, and just keep asking until you get down to like words that mean something, right? To most people. So it can be a tool. Not knowing can also be a tool to uncover BS, basically, I think is what I'm trying to say, right? I mean, one of the things that Richard Feynman says about learning things is like, if you want to actually know about a topic, take a piece of paper and write it out in all pure non-jargon English. Not like as soon as you write a term that you have to explain that in plain English. You can't just like suddenly drop, ionization in there and it's like, people know what that is, right? I picked something randomly physicsy sounding, right? So, so you have to like specify exactly what a thing means. So I think that's also really valuable, to be able to break something down because I think actually we have a tendency when you get really deep and specialized in programming or any discipline to tend to like lean on language, as if it means, like as if it encompasses everything and you actually have those things in your brain when you say the word, right? You don't actually. You've abstracted so that you can talk at a high level. But when you're actually talking with somebody else about how you're going to solve their problem with this, it helps to break it down to actually what the parts are, not the high level buzzword or encapsulation or whatever of that word. But yeah, I mean, all of that just really comes down to, yes, I agree that communication is the most important part of that. Which is why I want to explain that you take the flinty rock and you rub it against the thing to make the spark, Tim. Caveman Tim.
Right. That's what I was just going to say. That's exactly. I mean, that simplification into plain language is why Caveman Tim exists. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, and I think that's hugely valuable for both parties. To be honest, I mean that's the thing. So yeah, I have one here too. It actually touches a bit on this as well. So we may have kind of covered this topic, but it's Cheers to 200 from John Lethbridge. Hi, John. Hello again, Brett and Tim. First off, congratulations on episode 200-ish. The show has been a welcome regular companion on my daily commute, and I look forward to each new episode. I'm curious to see what Brett gets up to while Tim is off rediscovering his inner and possibly outer Yeti. maybe a series of interviews with other developers talking about games that they found particularly influential or formative, or perhaps just a well-deserved rest. Wanted to chime in on the question that came up last time about whether designers should be programmers. I think you both had some excellent points on the topic. I'm a designer, but have a varied skill set, including programming, as I started out in the indie space. Throughout my career, I've had the good fortune to work with some really great programmers, the best of whom also have a good sense of design. This overlap in skills has been a very beneficial bridge, making communication clearer and easier, and leading to better results than we would have gotten otherwise. One note of caution on this, though. Don't try to solve all the problems yourself. Sometimes extra knowledge in a field can lead you to trying to design around problems that you think you'd face if you were doing the implementation, but the programmer doing the implementation won't, as they have a different and possibly better way of tackling it. I like to sum this up as trust your experts. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the next 200-ish episodes of the cast. Wishing you both health and happiness. Cheers, John. P.S. Tim, are you taking anything along to do around the campfire at night? Something to read? Musical instrument? Or will you just yodel into the darkness to pass the time?
I guess to answer that really quickly, well, I mean, I will be reading. I definitely will bring some things there. I'm very weight conscious, so we'll have to see book-wise. You know, it's not really something that you carry. The thing about the PCT that some people may know is, at least the way that I'm going to be doing it, people do it for different reasons, for sure. Some people do it in groups and do it for sort of the social side of it, or, you know, the basically just like, you know, the interaction with other people along the way, meeting new people. I'm not really doing it for that reason. I intentionally am doing it solo, and I'm doing it very solitary in that way. And I'm probably going to be doing heavy miles based on my schedule, and that's also intentional. So I don't think I'll have much campfire. Sort of when I hit a camping spot, I will sleep immediately, and then I will get up and then keep walking. You know, I won't be spending a lot of time. There won't be a lot of downtime, is what I'm saying. So, but yeah, I'll be reading mainly. I think that's going to be my main thing.
Cool. As to the other part, yeah, I like both ends of that. The communication was the word that came up there again, in both John and Oliver's emails, which is definitely the thing. I mean, like you said, kind of in the follow up to Oliver, we're all doing such very different things across disciplines that communication is truly fundamental. It's the fundamental skill. And I've said it before in the cast that the first language programmers should learn is English, or whatever language is the lingua franca where you work and live, because you need to talk to other people. And all the programming skills in the world will not help you if you have to work with a team of people and you can't communicate. So yeah, hugely important. So
I also like his trust your experts advice. I think that's a good reminder.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the same thing there is that you have to be able to lean. I've always leaned on designers, even when I didn't agree. You know, there's definitely been times. I mean, sometimes you have to cajole me more. I can definitely remember you being like, "Come on, we got to try this," and you know that's fair. But yeah, you have to trust, and that's another part of saying, trying to say yes. That was actually something Jeff said as well. Like, you know, wouldn't it be cool if you want to be able to say yes, and being able to say yes to something that will improve your project is a great thing to be able to do. But that also requires trust that somebody's thought through and can figure out how to do it and fit it in without undue burdens on the other 90% of things you got to do. So,
yep.
All right. Why don't you hit the other email I sent you? Okay. This one's not too long.
The subject is Superman from Ben Zaug. Tim, it's almost 4 years later, but I also hate Superman. When the only limits to his long list of powers are a Deus Ex Machina or the I don't want to get caught, hurt somebody thought, it's just boring. He has no real motivation to help people or disguise himself as Clark Kent. Clark is the disguise, obviously, but where most heroes, their superhero costume is the disguise. Now, that's a good point. I didn't think of it that way. You said this back during Hitman 2. Oh, man. And I wanted you to know you aren't alone. This is my last classic series I'm listening to, and then I'll be all caught up. Congrats again on 200 episodes. I don't remember ever hearing this come up again. Maybe it does in the Hitman finale. Thanks, Ben from Iowa. Thank you, Ben. I thank you. I have Retribution. Superman is ridiculous.
Whoa. He said he doesn't like him, not that he's ridiculous. Okay. Come on. I mean, these are all superheroes in underwear on the outside. They're all ridiculous. So Batman is just as ridiculous as Superman. Just as ridiculous. Let's not go that far.
Fair enough.
However,
I don't want to put words in Ben's mouth. You're right.
That's right. Nice try. You think I wasn't going to hold you to that?
But thanks for the backup, and thanks for listening to the back episodes. You're finally caught up. And that's a good way to celebrate 200 is to bringing up the Superman debate.
Yeah.
Appreciative.
I've been playing the Batman most recent, whatever, Arkham Asylum. Knight. Yes. Yeah. I was trying to remember the name of it. But yeah. Come see me on my Twitch stream and see what I think about Batman. Okay, I have a final one here, which has got a little bit of fun because it's got an MP3 included. Do you have that open and downloaded?
Oh, what? No.
I guess you didn't read the email that I sent to you.
No, I only read the mails. I didn't read there's a little pre-part here, I see.
Yeah, the part at the top where I say, hey, I'm also sending you this email.
Who is it? It's not, the MP3 is not attached.
It's in the other email that I forwarded.
Oh, okay. Let me look for that. Forwarded. Here we go. Okay. Yep.
Okay, so I will read the email part, and then we can both listen to the MP3. So go ahead and get that downloaded so that you can do that. And then we'll do 3, 2, 1, and we can listen, and you can respond as it happens. We both can. Folks will just hear the MP3 on the cast. Anyway, this is from the Second Quest, who says, hey guys, congrats. The subject is congrats on the milestone in Tim's favorite boss supercut. Hey guys, congrats on reaching 200 plus episodes. As you look back on moments from past episodes, Tim mentioned how Castlevania Symphony of the Night was one of the top surprises for him, and that reminded me of one amusing aspect from that series that I just had to make a mini supercut of for you. Hopefully it'll help Tim continue to think of Symphony of the Night during his mountain trail hike when he finds himself in an environment made of all rocks. The observations, insights, and commentary continue to be appreciated. Keep up the good work. Billy. Technically not his real name, what with William and such. Thank you, Second Quest / Billy, if that is your real name, and I'm hearing it's not. All right, so you ready to listen?
Yep.
All right, 3, 2, 1, go. Tim is getting older as well, and I know he's kind of sometimes forgetful and may miss some stuff. We're going to play up to defeating Olrox, I believe is how it's pronounced. Oh, no, I said not that one. Yeah, no, that one, Olrox. I have no idea what that is, so that will earn
All
us.
rocks, is that what you said?
Olrox, yes.
Okay, all right.
Can't help you there. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who may look like a man, but who is secretly a 12-foot fire-breathing reptiloid.
Tim Longo?
Yes, well, that would have made more sense had you actually gotten to a particular boss, but since you did not.
The boss we were supposed to get to, or a different boss?
The boss we were supposed to get to.
Okay. Well, what is his name again? Or its name?
Olrox.
Olrox.
We were to play until Olrox's time. I fought that Olrox, just 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, well, an hour ago. And I think this was in Olrox's general area.
This is amazing. There's only one case. What was that guy that's Olanax or whatever that guy's name was.
Olrox, you mean?
Olrox, yeah.
Since we were talking about Richter as a boss, and you mentioned Olrox.
I finally went back and cleaned up Oranox or whatever his name is.
Olrox.
Olrox, yeah. He was a cool... that was probably one of my favorites so far. Yeah, the Oranox, I can't remember his name.
Olrox.
Olrox. From the second quest. On the last...
That's his real name.
It's definitely. That's a cool real name. What his parents were... her parents were very clever. Oh my gosh. I am crying over here.
Pretty good. So we do hope that your trail is not all rocks.
I'm such an idiot.
It's funny though how many times I said it as well. It's absurd. We never say any of the I certainly never say any of the proper nouns a billion times on the podcast, but
I never said it right.
No, you could not do it. When I started listening to this, it came in like a week ago, and I just couldn't. I was just sitting here laughing through the whole time because I was remembering like every time you'd say it, I'd be like, "Are you kidding me?"
Oh my God.
So pretty goofy. Incredible. Yep. Thank you for the supercut, the mini supercut of Olrox, their second quest / Billy.
Thank you, William.
Very good. Very, very good. Yeah. Anyway,
that made my day, made my year.
It's good times. Okay. As we wipe the tears from our eyes, let's look ahead to our next and final before you hit the trail series, which is a game that's come out. I think it's 25 years now. I feel bad. I should have looked this up before the cast. But that is, yes, you were going to say.
Well, you say, yeah. I thought you had mentioned the anniversary must be coming up, right? So
the anniversary is actually. Will happen while we're playing it. It's March 11th, which will actually occur just after this episode comes out. Actually, on the day it comes out. And that is 1995, so yes, 25 years ago, Chrono Trigger for the SNES. We're looking forward to playing that.
Oh, boy.
It is apparently pretty playable, actually, in both the mobile form for those who only have that available to them of the sort of platforms that it's currently available on, but it's also available on Steam. And apparently, as of a number of patches, they've got it both looking and sounding and feeling right. That they had a number of issues. It's interesting. Is this the only time we've returned to, other than John Romero, where we played Sigil, which is not really the same thing. But I think this might be the first time we've played another game by the same designer in Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was also the Final Fantasy IX designer.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
but it is one of the SNES RPGs, that the 16-bit RPG era that I think you kind of got to play, and we've not played any 16-bit RPGs.
No, right.
Nor have you ever played one, correct?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay. I have not played many myself, so it's because I didn't have consoles growing up. But I have played a couple through Game Boy emulation and things like that, but or Game Boy releases, I should say, of the same games. But I'm looking forward to this one because I've not played this one.
The only one that I guess counts, but I kind of put it in a different category. I guess it's technically a JRPG. I played the original Dragon Warrior.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that counts.
Before it became Dragon Quest.
Right.
Which is now the Dragon Quest series. But so I did play that back, and I think I finished that, but that was definitely back in the day. So yeah, I guess I did play that. But that's the Dragon Warrior back in the day had kind of an Eye of the Beholder sort of dungeon crawl. It was first. That's my memory of it. It was first person kind of thing, and they had the overworld. It was like very Ultima. I think that's why I liked playing that one. But,
interesting.
But sort of turn-based, top, isometric kind of like this, like an early Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger. I didn't realize it was Sakaguchi as well. But yeah, it's legendary. I've always heard that Chrono Trigger's the one, from so many people. So I'm excited, but
certainly a one. So it's, there were a number of good games at that time, but no, I'm super looking forward to this one because it is one that I've heard about for a long time. As being one that was really worth playing. It is not actually super long as JRPGs go. I think I looked it up, and it's more like the 20 hours, not like the 50 or 60 or something like that. So it should be it is a SNES era game, and they were not typically super long. I'm sure there are exceptions. But it'll be really fun to investigate that and look at that. It's kind of interesting just to think of that, looking it back, contrasting it with us having played Final Fantasy IX, because you having played Final Fantasy IX without having played other games from earlier, right? And that was sort of a throwback to in some ways, even if it was the modern hardware of the day in the PlayStation 1. It'd be interesting.
My JRPG education is definitely been weird, right? Because we played 9, so jumping kind of straight into that, which was like in that era of the modern Final Fantasies, was sort of its own unique thing, it seems like. And then like Kingdom Hearts, but that's
sure. Yeah,
I don't know what to call that.
Yeah, that's definitely had an impact, right? That right. And that's.
No, I'm glad we played it, but it's just an unorthodox example is what I mean.
Right. No. But it definitely, like, the modern Final Fantasies have some things in common, I would say, with Kingdom Hearts, and being more active, right? More real time and less sort of turn-based.
Right.
So there is some of that as well. Again, this is like a huge can of worms that I don't want to open as far as JRPGs go, because it's way more complicated than that. But just kind of saying that there have been more active elements in the battles in sort of the post-Final Fantasy IX and Kingdom Hearts era. There's been sort of more real-time elements in combat. So, yeah, and going back before that, you see kind of the more discrete turn-based stuff. So anyway, it'll be interesting to talk about it. I have not played Chrono Trigger. You have not played Chrono Trigger. It is an avowed classic, and it turns 25, maybe even the very day you are listening to this, the day this episode comes out. Mm-hmm. So what a good one to play before you head off on the trail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Every time I would ask somebody, my JRPG, sort of diehard friends who played, all of the sort of classic ones or big ones and are fans today, this is one of the ones that they would always mention to play. And I would always ask the question of like, well, I don't know if I'm going to go deep and play all of them or how much, but if I play one, which one would you say? And this is the one that they would often say. So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. We're going to look to play it over, 4 or 5 weeks. I haven't really figured that out yet. So check the Twitter feed, and Tim and I need to talk scheduling and things like that. But as far as how that'll shake out, but yeah, keep an eye on us on Twitter at DevGameClub, where of course you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
You can find me next weekend playing Chrono Trigger on Twitch at twitch.tv/Brett Douville, or on weeknights playing Batman Arkham Knight and talking about whether or not that's ridiculous. You can see me playing that. It's twitch.tv/Brett Douville. I've been having fun. It was that or Spider-Man were the things that were up for vote. You'll have a chance to vote in whatever next game I play on that stream as well at some point as I near the end of Batman, which, who knows, might be coming up fast at this point. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us this week, and good night.
Good night.